My name is Alan Luxembourg. I'm president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And since I see a lot of new faces here tonight, I thought I would just say that, well, first of all, we're delighted to be at the National Liberty Museum for the umpteenth time, our host and co-sponsor for many of our events here in Philadelphia. And for those of you not familiar with FPRI, it's a private nonprofit organization founded on the premise that a nation should think before it acts. That was in 1955. It's still good advice today. I won't make any political partisan comments. Tonight we welcome you to what might be called the Mike and Mike show. Three of our fellows, and I'm going to leave it to my colleague Mike Noonan to introduce the program. Mike is Director of our National Security Program and Director of Research for the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And with that, we welcome you here.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out tonight. I think we have a very good group of speakers here to talk about this important topic. The issue of drones has really been kind of recent in terms of public policy discussions. Drones have been around for a long time, or they can also be called remotely piloted aircraft, is what the Air Force likes to call them, or unmanned aerial vehicles, or unmanned combat aerial vehicles, etc. So there's a whole plethora of terms associated with the topic. What really has been new, or has been an innovation, has been the use of these armed drones and what they've been able to do in warfare. And that really has started after 9/11 by the US. But now we see a diffusion of these vehicles and these weapons to both other state actors and also non-state actors, and we can get into that in the discussion. And one nice thing about being at FPRI is we have scholars across the globe, but we also have scholars that are here in Philadelphia. And I'm delighted tonight to introduce my friends and colleagues, Mike Boyle and Mike Horowitz. Mike Boyle is an associate professor at LaSalle University. He's also a senior fellow at FPRI. You can see on the programs that we've put out some more details about him. He's completing a book about drones right now. And he is also a very sought after expert on issues of counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, etc. So I'll have Mike Boyle discuss those issues tonight. To his left, this is not a political statement, just a geographical one. Yeah. It is kind of ironic. I was saying, Mike Boyle is to my left, and then Mike Horowitz is further to my left, but that's probably not an accurate description ideologically. But Mike Horowitz is an associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the associate director of their new Perry World House, and Director Bill Burke-White is here in the audience as well. He is in the political science department there. He is also a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, as well as a few other institutes in Washington, Center for Strategic International Studies and the Center for New American Security. And he is a recognized academic expert on issues of military innovation and diffusion. And so I thought I would start this off by asking Mike Horowitz to talk a little bit about drone technology, its inception, and how it's being diffused today by both state and non-state actors.
Sure, thanks, Mike. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight. It's always a delight to be at FPRI events, especially to talk about pressing contemporary challenges. And I want to start by talking a little bit about what we mean when we say drones. I think one of the challenges when we talk about this is that we use one word to refer to a really broad package of technology. I mean, there are drones like the little quadcopter that you buy on Amazon, or like in the Verizon store where they try to sell you extra things when you get a new phone. There are drones like even slightly more sophisticated kinds of quadcopters that can carry put a really fancy like GoPro camera on and like follow you around or like deliver your wedding ring or something like that. Then there are drones like drones like when Mike Noonan was in Afghanistan that you could, or in Iraq, that you could pick up and throw up into the air and maybe have a couple kilometers that they can sort of travel around. And then there are drones like the MQ-9 Reaper that the United States has, that can be in the air for dozen or more hours and fire precision-guided munitions. And so I think one of the challenges in this is that we often conflate a bunch of different technologies under one category. And what I think was one of the most important things to understand about drone technology is that it's spreading and there's nothing we can do about it. And it's spreading because the underlying basis of the technology is commercial rather than military. This is not something like stealth technology, something that a military can invent, keep for themselves, and hope that no one will ever be able to copy it. If you can buy the basic technology on Amazon, our chances to stop the spread of this technology are of course, very low. And you can see this out in the world. There are about 90 countries, like 90, that have some kind of military drone program. There are 16 or 17 countries, depending on how exactly you count, that have armed drones. And there are another dozen that are pursuing them. So we tend to think about this technology like it's something that's ours. And by ours, I mean American, because the United States was the country that pioneered the use of drones in counterterrorism strikes and the signature strikes, other kinds of strikes. But the reality is now that the horse is out of the barn, down the street, and in a couple of different ways. The first is that China basically, hung a "we're open for business" sign on the door and has exported armed drones now to about 8 different countries. And many of those countries that the United States has refused to sell armed drones to, like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Jordan. The second thing is that it's proving really difficult to control the spread of this technology even to non-state actors. ISIS has purchased advanced commercial quadcopters and then modified them to do things like to launch firearms, to launch grenades, and even to drop sort of primitive bombs. And I mean, is the technology that ISIS is using, like the greatest technology in the world? Is it anything like the Reaper that the United States can operate? No. But what it demonstrates is that any actor with a tiny bit of engineering knowledge, access to Amazon, and access to something akin to a Home Depot, can do some damage. And I think that says something about the way that the technology is likely to spread. And so, and the last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is that I think it's important also to understand that drones are the tip of the iceberg for a broader revolution in warfare that could happen due to the introduction of military robotics. We think about drones as there's this one thing, right? The unmanned aerial vehicles, or uninhabited aerial vehicles, actually, to add another term, is the term that I prefer to use. Of course, you write uninhabited aerial vehicles in an article, and an editor comes back and says, just call it drones. But whatever. That's just the tip of the spear. Israel has deployed an uninhabited naval vessel that patrols their coastline. Russia has deployed an uninhabited ground vehicle in Syria and has an uninhabited ground vehicle that it wants to use to protect its ballistic missile bases. So drones are just the beginning, and one of the trends I think we're likely to see over the next decade or two is the further spread of military robotics as more and more capabilities we can do by remote piloting. And that's a trend that will not just affect the United States military, but many other militaries around the world as well.
Thanks, Mike. Mike Boyle. So I think a lot of us, when we think about drones, we think about its use in the war on terror, and particularly since the first innovation of putting these Hellfire missiles onto kind of first generation or probably second generation drones after 9/11. So here we are today in 2017. We've done, by estimates, nearly 700 drone strikes. And a lot of that happened after the Obama administration took office. But there has been an uptick as well in the Trump administration. So maybe if you could just tell us a little bit about the use of these since 9/11 and perhaps some future trends.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the points that I agree completely with Mike is that when we think about drones, you are talking about a wider package of platforms. So that's important to realize. And a lot of what we talk about for counterterrorism, we're talking about a specific type of drone that the U.S. has, a Predator drone and now a Reaper drone. They're sort of medium altitude, can loiter for a very long period of time. They're very different than the quadcopter that you buy at Amazon. I think that to sort of get a sense of how important drones would be, the technology existed for a very long time before the September 11th attacks. You can go back and find early examples of drones as target decoys and others during the Cold War in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. Lots of examples of the technology in kind of embryonic form in earlier times. It really advanced after around the September 11th attacks. And to give you a nice kind of illustrative statistic about the degree to which the US military kind of adopted the drone as a sort of preferred mechanism of counterterrorism, is that in 2002, the US military had approximately 50 sort of drones that they could arm. And they were still working quickly to arm drones and to figure out how you took the Predator drone into the air, attached a Hellfire missile, and made it stable. Today, it's at least 1,000, and I would say probably significantly more, depending on how much you count, how you count the drones and how you count particularly smaller drones. If you count the kind of drones that you see ground soldiers use and throw it in the air, it's even higher than that. Counterterrorism really sort of adopted the drone, or at least the Bush administration started to do this, although the Bush administration really didn't move it to the level that the Obama administration did. Despite the fact the Obama administration tried to break with a lot of Bush counterterrorism policies, Obama is actually responsible for ramping up the drone war in places like Pakistan, Yemen, and elsewhere, Somalia, and arguably other countries. We know that there have been, in places like Pakistan, 400 to 500 drone strikes. Sometimes launched from Afghanistan, sometimes launched from Pakistani bases. There's been a substantial number of drone strikes. Estimates are up to about 100 drone strikes in Yemen as well. And what's important about what the Obama administration started to do was they started to launch drone strikes outside countries where the United States was formally at war. And that's an important distinction if you think about the legal elements of this, even arguably the ethical elements of this. If I think about the use of a drone in a place like Afghanistan where the US remains formally at war, that's really a tactical choice. What's the better thing for me to be using, a manned aircraft or a drone? But when you start using drones in places where you're not formally at war, and you're essentially targeting individuals in those areas, you're spreading the area of the conflict, and you're pioneering a new method or new use of violence. And that's something that we really started to see under the Obama administration, expanded quite dramatically over time. Why did they adopt drones in that way? There's a bunch of advantages that drones have. They can loiter for a very long period of time. They can be connected to get information on targets. They can be relatively precise. We can be reasonably certain who we're targeting. And it keeps boots off the ground. And so the Obama administration recognized that if you're going to fight a global deterritorial enemy like Al-Qaeda or now the Islamic State that embeds itself in areas that are undergoverned, drones are a very effective way of degrading the leadership capacity. And that's effectively what they started to do. They started to try and take out leadership of militant organizations. Where it changed over time, and Obama later admitted this, he actually admitted it in an interview that he did at the end of his administration, that drones had become almost a kind of cure-all for terrorism in the time of his administration before he shifted policy in the second half, is that he started to shift towards attacking more foot soldiers for part of these organizations, to attacking militant groups that are only kind of broadly associated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, and to expanding the kind of reach of targeted killings, to codify this as a form of policy. There are a lot of debates as to whether this is effective or not. On the one hand, you can see clear examples of targeted killings with drones killing and removing insurgent leaders who are in fact very, very bad guys. But there are a lot of other debates about whether it's in fact killing civilians, whether it's killing militants lower down on the organizational chain, and whether it's producing backlash effects that are outweighing the advantages you get from killing that individual bad guy, right? And that's the sort of crux of the debate you get about the strategic effectiveness of this. At the root of this is very difficult to tell because getting good data on who you're targeting is not often very easy to do. And there's a lot of debates that the Obama administration had about how you count who's a civilian, who's not a civilian, how do I know whether I'm doing this in a kind of ethical and humane way. What I would highlight as I think a particularly big danger here is that the fact the Obama administration kept a large part of the targeted killing within the executive branch. With relatively little scrutiny by the Congress, relatively little scrutiny by the courts. Not no scrutiny at all, but largely conducted within the infrastructure of the military. And why that's a problem is that when you have a new administration come into place, that new administration inherits that infrastructure. right? If you create a machine of targeted killing with drones, and you govern that by rules that are entirely within the executive branch, when there's the transfer of power, you hand that to the Trump administration. And what we've seen since January has been an uptick in the air war, particularly in Iraq and Syria. If you go back to months like March 2017, there were at least 1,000 airstrikes the US conducted. Now, it's important to note, not all of those are with drones. Some of those are with drones, some of those are with manned aircraft. But there's been a substantial increase in the number of airstrikes, as well as a substantial increase in civilian casualties. And one of the great questions here is, how will Trump use the infrastructure of a drone program largely created inside the executive branch in the Obama administration, and will he use it governed by the same limits that Obama did? The answer that the military currently gives is, yes, he's operating it just as, in fact, Obama did, with a strong degree of internal limits and checks, and you shouldn't worry about abuse. But the statistics themselves are raising a lot of concerns among human rights advocates to say, if we're launching those numbers of strikes, if we're seeing an increase in the number of civilian casualties, this might have been a dangerous precedent created by Obama that was then potentially exploited by the Trump administration.
Thanks. Yeah, so a couple of things that you pointed out there. I mean, one issue is that the authorization for the use of military force after 9/11 was so sufficiently broad to go after the perpetrators of the attack and those who helped them, that did really kind of expand the area. There wasn't a specific, it wasn't, the authorization for the use of force didn't say Afghanistan, borders of. So there was some legal wrangling there. But did the uptick in the use of drones also, well, two issues. One, did the uptick in the use of drones by the Obama administration help them get out of the quandary of the detainee policies that they inherited from the Bush administration? And secondly, didn't drones really help these other states to kind of externalize the problem? I mean, when I was in Iraq in 2006, I remember the first time I saw a drone was this thing that sounded like a lawnmower that flew over my head. But these aren't particularly, we can talk about this later, unmanned aerial vehicles aren't particularly sophisticated pieces of equipment. So a country that has a very sophisticated air defense system would be able to knock out most of these systems from the sky. Now, I think that will get better over time, but for a country like Pakistan, it allowed them to kind of play the game, where they said, well, it's the United States that's doing this, and we can't really get around it. In Yemen, for instance, the Saudis have said that when airstrikes go bad, that it's a US drone strike to kind of externalize the blame onto us. So how would you respond to those
Well, so I think
statements?
a couple different things. The first is the authorization to use military force, I think, is something that Americans really should be thinking a lot about. You know, the initial declaration of war against al-Qaeda was a war against a deterritorialized international terrorist group that has multiple places where it operates. It's been then stretched to include operations in Syria and Iraq, arguably in Pakistan, and to say, well, if you're in the sort of broader milieu of al-Qaeda, we can target you on the basis of the AUMF. That's stretching the legal justification of it. And as an interesting kind of side note to this, Tim Kaine, the former vice presidential candidate under Hillary Clinton's candidacy, he actually was one of the people who argued that the United States needs to have a debate over the AUMF, that we shouldn't be giving the executive branch the kind of remit to just expand where we're launching drone strikes, to be using the same legal justification to allow us to go after al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to attack militants in Libya. And I think there is a question there as whether we should do it. With respect to the detainee policy, there's been a lot of debate, and there's been some Obama administration officials that have talked about why the shift to drones happened. And the argument that they made was that after the Bush administration with Guantanamo Bay, they inherited such a mess, such a legal mess, arguably such an ethical mess when you capture prisoners on the battlefield, that it's so difficult to get convictions that essentially what happened was the Bush administration threw a lot of them in Guantanamo Bay, didn't have answers as to what to do with them, and 16, 17 years later, we're still trying to figure out where those people go. The answer was, if you are going to create a legal mess trying to capture that person, if you can't present evidence in a court about that person, then it might be easier to kill that person on the battlefield than to bring them back to a prison. And so one argument is that the sort of legal problems about prosecuting terrorists actually produced a kind of perverse incentive to kill rather than capture. And there have been people who have come out and said that the problem with that is that, you know, dead men tell no tales. You get no intelligence from people that have been killed from this. It's better to capture. But there is a serious problem about how we prosecute, particularly when the evidence about what they've been doing on the battlefield or perhaps what they've been planning is classified evidence that you can't admit in some courts, right? And so that raises a really interesting kind of legal question as to why, in fact, you would do it. In terms of the sort of political or strategic costs associated with it, I would argue that you can clearly point to examples of drones that have taken very, very bad guys off the battlefield and that have weakened organizations. I mean, if you get some of the accounts that come out from Al-Qaeda admitted, bin Laden's diaries admitted that they were terrified of drones, that drones had really inhibited their organizational effectiveness. So if you want to look at it, the very narrow degree of tactical effectiveness, drones do work against some terrorist organizations. The question becomes when you put that next to the political and strategic costs. And the political costs are what you're highlighting. If the US is using drones against them, and it allows Pakistan to play a very cynical game where it blames the US for civilian casualties, it blames the US for violating its sovereignty, or perhaps even it gives Pakistan an excuse not to move on militants in its own tribal regions, right? Giving them an incentive to say, let the US handle this as a form of aerial policing, then you have to ask the question as to whether it's a strategic net benefit for the United States. That's a question about the sort of second and third order political and strategic effects that follow on from the decision to just target that bad guy on the battlefield. And then one part of that is to ask the question about whether there are precedents. If you are creating a precedent by enabling targeted killing around the globe. It's worth pointing out that some of the states that Mike pointed out have now bought other drones have been now engaging in their own targeted killing. So we're starting to see Nigeria use targeted drone strikes, Pakistan has used them, Iraq has also used them, and are retrofitting, in some cases, Chinese-made drones in order to be able to replicate policies done by the United States. And so that's a sort of precedent question, and I think it's important to weigh against the real clear benefit of getting this very bad guy off the battlefield.
Well, I think in terms of the AMF, I think there's probably some trepidation both from Congress and the executive branch to test this too much, because it could have far-reaching implications if the courts weigh in on this. If they don't say it's a political issue, it could change dynamics between the branches a bit in terms of that. Mike, do you have any comments about?
I have several comments.
Okay.
All right, the first is that when we talk about the executive branch using drones, I actually think Mike's overgeneralizing a little bit in that you have two types of drone operations. You have Title 10 and non-Title 10 operations. Title 10 operations are those conducted by the United States military that we know occur according to, or in theory occur according to, the Department of Defense has a law of war manual, and their Department of Defense is actually reasonably transparent about. We actually know a lot about the decision-making process of how it is that a drone strike occurs in the Department of Defense. The other drone strikes are conducted by three-letter agencies, and there's a lot less transparency involving them. And one of the things the Obama administration tried to work on was actually moving drone strikes from the agencies over to the Defense Department with the idea that they're actually more accountable there. And so I think the issue about congressional oversight is an issue with all uses of force, not just drones. And so, because I think one of the problems when we talk about drones is we tend to blame the technology instead of blaming the people using the technology and the decisions being made about the technology. And you see that in this case when we talk about, we shouldn't use, drones are causing this, or sort of drones are causing that. I think it often depends a lot more on how it is that we are using them and whether we are using them in ways that comply with the law of war. And this relates also to some of these issues of precedent setting, because I think that it's an exaggeration in some ways or not an exaggeration. I think it's a typically American conceit to think that other countries wouldn't use drones for targeted killing if we didn't, because countries make decisions about the use of military force based on their own interests, and they use the technology that they can acquire. And when the Chinese will sell them, a CH-4 or Wing Lung already armed with, something that at least line of sight is precise, and you're Nigeria and you want to go after Boko Haram and you're having trouble finding them, drones are a really attractive tool. And I think those drones would be an attractive tool whether or not the United States engaged in significant drone strikes. And so I think what we need to be careful of is that in overestimating the influence that the U.S., that's restraint on the part of the U.S. would have on other countries, we don't undermine the ability of the U.S. to take advantage of a tool that has a lot of utility. It has a lot of limits too, to be clear. Like they're slow, they're not stealthy. This is why we only use them in places where other countries don't have air defenses, because they'd be easy, like anybody with like any air defense worth their salt could shoot down basically all of our drones. But I think we need to be careful not to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater here. And by that I mean using drones in a way that is legal and responsible and complies with the law of war, and not, because the sort of the cat's already out of the bag with regard to other countries.
Okay, jump in.
Sure.
So a couple things sort of on this. The first is the distinction between the sort of the military or the JSOC drone strikes and the CIA drone strikes that Mike raised is a really, really important one. And there are a lot of much clearer safeguards and much clearer degrees of congressional accountability on the military half of it than there are on the CIA half. There's absolutely no question that that's right. I think one of the concerns, though, is it's not entirely clear, because in part we have such issues dealing with whether there have been civilian casualties, that we can be clear that JSOC kills fewer civilians than the CIA drone strikes. When there was a discussion under the Obama administration about transferring CIA drone programs over to JSOC, one of the debates at the time was Congress pushed back and said, no, we can find lots of examples, and particularly in Yemen, where JSOC was not careful enough, and we want to be certain that they're killing few civilians. So to some extent, that bureaucratic fight is important. It's also worth pointing out that the Trump administration has reversed what the Obama administration was trying to do, which was to take away drone strikes away from the CIA. They're back in the hands of the CIA. And so what you really have inside the United States government, both again within the executive branch, are essentially two parallel programs, working with broadly same objectives, slightly different list on picking targets, slightly different sets of bureaucratic procedures, and very different sort of mechanisms of congressional kind of accountability. On the question of precedent, I think Mike's absolutely right that when you think about it, if a state gets a drone, they're going to do what's in their interest to do so. And they're not going to sit there and clutch their pearls and say, oh my God, the US did this, are we allowed to do it? They're not always going to be kind of concerned on precedent. But I would say there is a question about whether the US is a kind of norm setter in that international system, and whether they have an argument, or whether there is an argument that the US is safer in a rule sort of oriented, law-abiding oriented system. My concern really with what I've seen under both Bush, then moving to Obama, and indeed Trump, is that the US is increasingly launching airstrikes in a larger number of environments and pushing aside issues of sovereignty. And in the long run, if you continue to push aside issues of sovereignty and conduct this kind of larger air war in multiple countries at the same time, there is a danger that other countries are going to start to follow your example. Now, fortunately, we haven't seen a lot of examples of this. We have not seen a lot of cases where countries have started to do it. But we're also only seeing a point in time where Russia, China, and others are getting drones that have the capability of the United States. And so I would, if I were the United States, I would argue for prudence. You are better off in a very constrained drone policy that respects territorial sovereignty, that doesn't sort of push aside territorial borders, than one that's more permissive, as both Democrat and Republican administrations have done.
So I think the interesting thing here is so Mike and I think, because our names are both Mike, agree on the ends here, which is a rules-based sort of usage of these systems. The question is how to get there. And I actually think one of the biggest limitations in US policy right now is something that we haven't talked about yet, which is that, speaking of pearl clutching, that's exactly what the US does when it comes to exporting drones. We basically treat drones as a more serious thing to export to a country than an F-35. And what that does is it means that America's allies and partners, like the Saudis, like Jordan, like Iraq, all then import those systems from China. And with importing those systems from China comes Chinese soldiers and Chinese training. The alternative, of course, is that they get those systems from the United States through the Foreign Military Sales Program, which includes assurances that countries get American training so they understand how to responsibly use those systems, and American instruction on using them responsibly in ways that are connected to the law of war. It's one of the reasons why in the late Obama administration, the US actually launched an effort to try to get countries around the world on board with a sort of nascent code of conduct about drone usage. And my hope is actually that to go to a tiny bit political place, I wonder whether the focus on jobs in the Trump administration could lead to a move to potentially increase U.S. drone exports, to have sort of less pearl clutching on that front, and whether that could actually improve the ability of the United States to encourage countries to use the drones that they're going to get in ways that are responsible and conducive with international law. Because however you worry about the U.S., going beyond what you're necessarily supposed to do, worry a lot more about China, and about if the only training you've gotten how to use a system is from China.
And countries there as well. I mean, if you are the provider of those weapons, you can also cut off things like spare parts
Yep.
and other things that don't allow the country to maintain them. Of course, countries also know this, and they'll diversify their sources so that they don't get cut off. There's a famous example of this from Vietnam when the Australians were buying weapon systems from Sweden, and Sweden didn't approve of their policies in Vietnam and decided to just shut off spare parts and ammunition for those weapon systems after that. We're going to open it up for Q&A, but before I raise that, there is a film called Eye in the Sky. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you watch it. I don't think it's a perfect film, but I think it covers a lot of issues here. So we'll open up for Q&A. Bob, Peyton, wait for the microphone. Remember, we follow Jeopardy rules at FPRI, so please make any comments or speeches in the form of a question.
I'm trying to contextualize all this stuff, and my question is coordinates. In order for these drones to be effective, they have to know the coordinates of a place at a time in relation to bad people and maybe good people and things like that. And what kind of intelligence, and I'm aware of another country, not the United States, that puts special forces units into places to physically observe from the ground places where they think bad guys will be, and then to communicate a message and make a judgment, give them the coordinates, and judgment that it is or isn't safe to take out the bad guys with or without potentially jeopardizing civilians. So, which I assume is a lot of what's going on in terms of, rather than just a place, a mosque at a given, in Ramadan, when a lot of people are going there, and the coordinates of the courtyard of the mosque. If you wanted to, you could wreak havoc there without people on the ground. But otherwise, how does it work? How do they get updated information to know they're doing the right thing, and what are the parameters around it?
So a couple of things. I mean, first, I think back to Mike's original point, which this varies a lot based on your drones, right? If you're talking about a very small kind of drone that you would throw out of your backpack on the ground, that might just be line of sight, and you might have not a lot more information than what's around the hill and what the drone camera shows you. But if you're talking about the kind of Reaper drones, the MQ-9 drones that the U.S. more commonly uses, there's a very large information surveillance reconnaissance infrastructure behind that. There's a very large tail to a drone. We have this image, it's just a guy in a cockpit wheeling it around, and then he just presses a button on what he sees. It's actually much more complicated than that. There's the ground control station that controls the drones. There's also a very large information cell that is there that is processing imagery. Huge numbers of intelligence analysts support each drone that's in the air. They're often tracking aerial imagery, but also tracking this against information they might pull from other sources, cell phones, even in some cases as much as facial recognition technology and things that would allow them to make sure that they know who's supposed to be in that target. They also take advantage of the fact that they can loiter over conflict zones for very long periods of time to watch them and to make sure that they have, in a sense, the person they want to try and attack, and they can get at them at the right way. And so it is a case under which it's sort of GPS, it's information, intelligence analysis, and a very, very large infrastructure behind it. And it goes through a command and vetting process and also goes through a legal process. The notion that the ground control pilot is simply pressing a button and not talking to the lawyers and the intel analyst isn't in fact actually true. We know that when you do a drone strike, there are cases under which they will debate, well, if you come in at this angle, you might kill more people. If you wait 3 hours, you might see that truck move and kill fewer people. And so there is a deliberative process. And one of the biggest arguments for drone strikes is that it is essentially a more deliberative form of warfare. If you think about where you are, in an intense environment where your life is at stake, you might have to press the button or leave. In this case, you can actually watch a target for a very long time. So there's a very, very large bench of information. It's also worth pointing out that I think that's one of the functions of drones that doesn't get talked about as much, but is in fact actually more important to the military, is the information collection and analysis portion of the drones. The US military is collecting a vast volume of data from drones and other sources every single day, and they're actually struggling to figure out ways that they can analyze it and turn it into useful, effective information. One of my favorite vignettes about this is that they've actually contacted ESPN. Because ESPN is very good at saying someone caught a football in 1965, let's get a clip of that, and figuring out how you analyze video imagery extraordinarily quickly. And the Pentagon actually brought in ESPN to say, well, look, we get all these hours and hours and hours of video. How do I sift through this amount of video and find what I want? The bigger problem that they're getting is they're actually getting too much information for the analysis capacity they have. And so that's becoming a real challenge, and that's why they're moving into sort of things like autonomous systems and others that would be able to analyze information even more quickly.
Yeah, the hope is supercomputing, AI, machine learning, et cetera, gives you the capacity to analyze that depth of data much faster. No, that was a great answer.
Ma'am? Wait for that. Yeah.
Well, I saw Eye in the Sky, and I thought it was a really terrific movie, and I just wondered, it was really scary to me, and I wondered how realistic it is and what wasn't realistic about it. And you probably wouldn't tell us that, but.
I think it's a little more overwrought than, a little more emotional than the reality. That being said, I mean, one of the fears with drones initially had been that it would be kind of this remote control push-button warfare where the operators were separated, and the initial studies we've seen suggest that drone pilots get PTSD at very similar rates to pilots actually in the cockpit flying over targets, and there are actually arguments for why it can be even more disjointing, in that if you're, say, deployed in a combat zone or near a combat zone, you're generally on a base only with other military people living and working with them, and there's space to sort of talk about what's going on. Whereas you could be at, like Creech Air Force Base, you could be at Creech in Nevada and be, doing drone operations every day, and then, like go to the casino, or, like go to like In-N-Out Burger, or, whatever. And it's it's more disorienting. I think there's an argument for why it can actually be more disorienting. But I thought Eye in the Sky was very good. I just think it's a little less. It's not quite as emotional, but that makes sense because it's a movie.
Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I saw an Eye in the Sky as well, and my sense of it is, again, it dramatizes and puts in a very short time frame what are real issues. To some extent, that's useful to illustrate them. I think the other thing that struck me at the time was they were using the small sort of bug drone that they were flying into the room of the insurgent's house. Yeah. Those things exist. They're not exactly used in regular deployment, right? And so to some extent, this was suggesting you had more information about what was going on in the room where the insurgents were meeting than you might always have. And there is an interesting sort of empirical question about, well, how often do you get it right? How often do you know what's happening inside those rooms? If you know what's happening inside those rooms, you can have relatively high confidence. If you don't, then that's the case. And there is, I think, less evidence that the US military always knows what's happening inside those rooms. Sometimes they certainly do, but not always cases.
I think really its value, particularly for people preparing to be in the military or officers, is just to look at it and view it and discuss kind of the moral ethical dimensions of it, talk about the different interactions there, and use that as kind of a tool of learning rather than as something that's, is firm reality for that. Let's see. Can we get over here?
In some sense, can you do anything that you might do with the drone with satellites? It seems to me that we have a very sophisticated system of satellites. We use them for the reconnaissance, for the visual identification, for the coordinates, the determining the coordinates. And that would seem like the logical extension of drones would be to use those, whether it is, I can even imagine one a big bay that would release drones. So you don't have to put them up from some Air Force base someplace, but you could release them from satellites. So I was thinking of satellites as the logical extension of drone warfare.
So, I mean, there have been experiments actually. You taking small drones coming out of cargo jets is where you're seeing that more, because there's like a re-entry issue if you're talking about a satellite. I mean, the challenge with satellites is that they can't loiter, and so what you get out of a drone that you don't get out of a satellite is the persistence of the surveillance of the target. The satellite can tell you, like, all right, like that's the house, and those are the coordinates of the house. But if you want to know, and you don't know because you don't actually have the bug drone that's like in the room, but if you want to be able to then track for a week, what are the movements of the people going in and out of the house in almost a real-time basis, so then you can decide, like, all right, based on the movements of all these people over the last week, we're confident that, with some probability that the lawyers accept, that only the insurgent is in the house right now, and thus it's time to strike. You need persistence for that, and to get that persistent surveillance, you need a drone. I mean, that being said, I think there's a lot of we can do a lot with satellites. You just can't stay over the target.
And different angles as well. Right. Whereas in a satellite, you're usually getting kind of straight overhead.
And you can also move too, right?
Yeah.
You can adapt to time. You can say, go this way. We'd like to see this, and that's what you see Global Hawks do a lot of times
Right.
as well, right?
Ma'am? Wait for the microphone, please.
I'm wondering, some of these terrorist organizations, I mean, is there any evidence that they might use drones? Why wouldn't, I mean, if they can buy the drones at Amazon, would that achieve their objectives also?
So, I can do this if you want. So there's a lot of evidence of terrorist organizations that have gotten drones. The most sophisticated user of them is Hezbollah. Hezbollah has regularly buzzed sites inside Israel. It likes to fly over Israeli nuclear reactors, and its drones are regularly shot down by the Israeli Air Force. Hamas has also had drones. The Islamic State is using drones. What the Islamic State is trying to do a little bit more than other actors has been to try and figure out how you can attach explosives to drones. So they've been getting relatively crude drones, oftentimes not a lot better than what you can buy off of Amazon. The question is, can the drone actually hold a payload, and can you drop it?
Yeah.
So if you go online, you can actually see, the last statistic I saw was there was at least 60 different filmed Islamic State drone strikes, where the Islamic State would send the drone into the air, they would have a payload of explosives, they'd go over an enemy force in Syria, drop it, and film it. You can also find examples of groups like the FARC in Colombia that have had their own drones. We know that Russia is supplying Ukrainian forces, pro-Russian Ukrainian forces with drones. So we're starting to see a lot more non-state actors begin to use drones. The question is, are they sufficient to achieve their objectives? For the most part, there's such an enormous gap sort of in the technology of what the Islamic State can have versus what the United States can have, that it's not very easy for them to achieve their objectives alone with a drone. Could they, however, change our calculation of vulnerability? It seems to suggest, the US military seems to think so. They've been talking a lot about counter-drone technology. They don't want US soldiers in Iraq or in Syria suddenly figuring out, hey, there's a drone coming towards me, and before they figure out what's happening to them, they have an explosive on top of them. It's not that it's likely alone to achieve their objectives, but it is likely to remap our sense of vulnerability within conflicts. And that's important only in the sense that when there's such a large power asymmetry, that can give some sort of at least short-term tactical advantage to these groups. So I don't think it's a game changer, but it allows them to hurt people they wouldn't ordinarily be able to hurt.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I would just add that what Mike's talking about here are two different vectors by which non-state actors get drones. The first is the sort of Hezbollah-Hamas way, which is that Iran sends them there. Right. And Hezbollah actually allegedly has an armed drone that they got from Iran. The second way, and this is more the Islamic State way, is the build it in your basement, modify a piece of commercial equipment sort of way. And this is, speaking of precedent and mimicry, I think what the Islamic State is doing right now which doesn't require that significant, like a crazy amount of technical expertise, I'm sure is a blueprint for other kinds of non-state actors that might think about these sorts of things. And it's a huge deal, I think, for the American military. I was speaking at a conference a few weeks ago on land power and the future of land power, and one of the drones are actually one of the things that was discussed, because what have we assumed for the last generation or more? We assume air superiority. We assume that our soldiers on the ground, if someone's coming after them, it's from somebody else on the ground. And even sort of ISIS-style drones change that equation enough that it thus requires investments to counter them.
You mentioned that a country that had good air defenses would be able to eliminate the danger from drones. Are you speaking about a specific type of drone? It certainly sounds like these smaller ones that maybe are just used for surveillance, but trying to modify to deliver weapons would be less at risk from an air defense system.
Well, there's a cost equation here. They're not that bad. There's an example where a U.S. partner earlier this year reportedly used a Patriot missile, which costs a couple million a shot, to shoot down a quadcopter, which it turns out you can do. The Patriot won, but that's like not a cost exchange that you really want to, like a cost per shot exchange you really want to do. Which is one reason why you've seen investments in all sorts of like counter. I mean, there have been investments in like birds, in nets, in lasers, in all sorts of like small scale electromagnetic disruption, all sorts of things to try to knock out drones without having to resort to deploying your sophisticated air defenses. Yeah, actually, do you want to?
So, I mean, if you're thinking about larger drones, things like a Global Hawk or a Reaper, that's going to come up on air defenses very clearly. I mean, they're going to know that that's coming. Radar's going to pick that up. Yeah. When you get to the very smaller drones, that's where it's going to be a case of it may not be picked up. And that's where you're seeing the counter-drone technology. I mean, they're using things like Hawks, right? Hawks are very efficient at knocking drones out of the sky. And we're starting to see the U.S. military experiment with a whole series of weapons from as crude as I shot it out of the sky to lasers and other things that were designed to knock the drones out of the sky. And it's a really interesting problem. If non-state actors are going to take those sort of low-grade commercial drones you can buy on Amazon, how do you stop that from becoming a kind of threat in a Western city? How do you stop that from being attached with explosives? One way they're talking about doing so is geofencing. You restrict targets, you restrict areas where the drone quite simply cannot go. So if you try and fly a commercial drone over the White House at the moment, it's likely to just come straight out of the sky because it's not allowed to fly there. You can't program it to fly there. But you can only do that so much, right? If you're thinking about every stadium in the country, every place in the country where you could get that, it's very hard to stop very, very small drones with explosives. This is why you often hear drone exclusion zones on things like the Super Bowl and other places, because they know that could probably get through. If it's low enough, you wouldn't be able to do much on sort of stopping that.
DJI, which is the biggest consumer drone company, is actually building geofencing into the drones that it's selling now in the U.S. market. In some ways, to try to preempt potential regulations that could require them to do so. On the other hand, DJI is a Chinese company, and I don't know.
Hi, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the moral and ethical implications of the use of drones, especially, I think you alluded to it earlier, when it is expanded outside the the countries that we're at war with. You mentioned that it's all housed in the executive branch, so where is the oversight, and can you speak a little bit about the decision-making process where they are making the decision to use these, and what's the implications for the American public where there's a lack of transparency here? And does Congress really even want to have this discussion?
I mean, the answer is no, Congress doesn't want to have this discussion. But I think actually this is a really interesting and important question, because I think in some ways where what feels right might depend on what the other options are. And is what we're talking about the use of a drone, and the alternative if we don't use a drone is an inhabited fighter or a ground team, or is what we're talking about a drone versus nothing? Because if what we're talking about is a drone versus an inhabited fighter or a ground team, then almost certainly there's almost more opportunity for oversight and deliberation, because you can have the sort of lawyers and superiors and all those people basically can be in the room having a conversation about whether it's okay to fire this weapon, which gives you actually a lot more control. Whereas if it's an inhabited aircraft, you might be over target for 30 seconds, and you've got to either press the button or not. And so that those strikes in some ways are, I think, even less transparent. Or why don't we put it this way, we're a lot more willing with those strikes to delegate the decision to the pilot and say, all right, this is ultimately the pilot's judgment. They're making a split-second, not exactly a split second, but they're making a very short-term decision, and so we're going to trust them to do that. Where I think one of the interesting things about drones is that because they introduce the possibility of actually more time and more deliberation, then the bar essentially for what we want goes up as well. And while in general I'm pretty obviously I've defended the U.S. drone program, I think the lack of my personal belief is that the lack of transparency about how drone strikes were conducted, which the Obama administration started to address, I think, too late, did a disservice to the program, because I think people would actually be reassured rather than upset if they had known earlier just how many different steps the U.S. military at least goes through before firing weapons from drones. But I'm sure Mike has thoughts on this, so I want to let him jump in.
I mean, so I'm a critic of this, of the drone program. I think on a couple points I agree with Mike. The first is, if you have the possibility of loitering and looking at a target, in theory it can be much more deliberative. You can send it through much more legal check than you might otherwise do if you have 30 seconds over a target and have to fire and forget. That does potentially give you the option of a much more deliberative form of warfare. And there have been people who have made, I think, interesting arguments that you could say this form of warfare, this form of killing is actually ethically superior because it allows you to have this deliberative element. My concern is largely that it is not effectively checked by the other branches. So Congress has relatively little effective check. A little bit more when it's a JSOC strike, much less so when it's a CIA strike. And the reporting requirements to Congress have changed over time. Initially, the Obama administration didn't report very much to Congress. Then in the second half of the administration, it became a lot more forthcoming, started to produce details on the number of strikes and civilian casualties. Trump has recently rolled that back. The same thing with the courts. Initially, the Obama administration took almost a kind of Fight Club approach to the courts. We don't really talk about the drone program. We don't even acknowledge it exists. Over time, they did eventually concede that it existed, but they fought the courts on jurisdiction. Part of the reason why is that no one wants to shrink powers in part of the executive branch. No president wants to make the office smaller. And no president wants to say, well, here's my option for the use of force. Let me constrain myself in these ways. What was interesting about Obama is he recognized this. He actually said it multiple times during the administration, there is a danger that this could become an unconstrained weapon in the hands of other people. We need to think about a long-term plan under which we govern and control drone strikes. I think he kind of got to it too late, and this I agree with Mike. He started to take some really important steps. One of them was to raise the standard on when you can use a drone strike to the point where there are almost no civilian casualties. And that's one of the reasons why drone strikes dropped off in the last several years of his administration. He also started to release the data. The problem is that because you institutionalize this entirely within the executive branch, it leaves it to the discretion of the next administration on whether to change this. And Obama knew this. In 2012, he quickly started to write a drone playbook in an attempt to sort of constrain a potential Romney administration from how it might handle this weapon that had been built. Now the problem is it's in the hand of the Trump administration.
So here's a place where I think I'm confused. Mm-hmm. I don't understand what you mean when you say exclusively in the executive branch, because drones are no more exclusively in the hands of the executive branch than soldiers on the ground or inhabited fighters or why shouldn't there just be a standard for the use of force that, whether it's a ground team, an inhabited aircraft, a cruise missile, or a drone, all of those uses of force need to happen in ways that comply with the law of war and have the same degree of transparency to the American public. And so I think that the drone program is no more opaque than any other use of force, I think by the United States. And so this is why I worry sometimes when we get caught up in the drone, as opposed to the standard that we should be demanding for all uses of force, regardless of the platform.
So I disagree on this on the point. I agree that we should have the same standard on the use of force regardless of the platform. And if we could have the highest standard for that, I would be absolutely fine with it. My concern here is that if you hand a weapon like this into the hands of the CIA and take it off recognized battlefields, there is a strong potential for abuse, particularly when you're not releasing data on civilian casualties, when there are questions about the sort of empirical methodology by which you judge civilian casualties, and you have an intelligence agency that's working in a paramilitary capacity, launching its own strikes in parallel to a Defense Department operation. If I could wave a wand and do this, what I would do is assume the same sort of high standards of civilian casualties.
CIA sending a ground team or sending a drone?
See, the question is, I don't always think it's the same. It's not always a choice between a ground team and a drone. I mean, a lot of times we make this argument and say, well, it's keeping our own guys away from it because the alternative would be troops on the ground. And in fact, actually, each situation is very different. We're not actually countenancing that in places like Pakistan or in Yemen, right? Special forces, arguably, but not regular ground troops. Yeah. And so I think I would rather you measure each particular case, rather than say it's always a choice of ground troops or drones. It varies by circumstance, and I think it varies very substantially by circumstance for declared battlefields and non-declared battlefields. I'm much more uncomfortable about the use of the president having the right to pick individuals off battlefields, off declared battlefields with no congressional authorization, saying that person is affiliated with Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, presenting no evidence to any court outside the executive branch, and then deciding whether that person should die.
But that's true whether it's a drone or not.
That's
not about the drone. That's about the use of force.
But what we've seen is that drones have been more commonly used off the battlefield than manned aircraft.
Oh, so now we're getting to your argument.
Okay.
So your argument's actually that drones make the use of force more likely.
I would argue it does. Yeah.
So that's the problem?
Yes, in a sense. I mean, do we want a case under which force is easy? Do you want a case under which we are insulated from the cost of war?
Yes.
Now, Mike says yes. And I am not in any way suggesting you make it I would.
You want to send U.S. forces?
No. I don't want this to be the case under which we can fight out of sight, out of mind, with very little political cost and very little accountability. I wouldn't want to put U.S. soldiers in harm's way sort of capriciously or out of unnecessary. And I don't think you have to suffer, in a sense, and put people at risk of harm. There's no reason to artificially put our own soldiers at harm. But do we want to create a situation under which force is easy? I mean, we know that our presidents don't particularly like to risk our own blood in conflicts. We are currently fighting air wars in 7 to 8 countries, right, depending on how you count it.
I mean, war is not football. And I'd rather that I'm from Boston. I would rather the U.S. be the New England Patriots and just steamroll the opposition. Like, there's no rule that, it needs to be like a 50-50 shot. I mean, I'd rather win by a lot.
Yeah, and see, I'm a Philly guy, so I'm an Eagles supporter. So I've got nothing. I got no comparison. And on that note, I'd rather them fight fair and only fight dirty when necessary. That's the way I'd say it.
Well, I think we've run out of time here, and maybe the other question that we can ask another day is: has the use of drones, cyber, special operations forces become sort of the new American way of war, and we are trying to get to this kind of very scalpel-like uses of force and the moral, strategic, and ethical issues with that. But unfortunately, we've run out of time here. Thank you all for coming out. If this is the first FPRI event that you've come to, I hope you enjoyed yourself. Bring a friend next time. If you are a regular attendee, bring others out in the future, and look at our calendar for future events. Thank you very much. Thank you.